feel like we're on day 457,000 of January. But reading-wise, it also was a really fast month. Like when I went back and I looked at all of the books that I read, which was 13, by the way, I was giddy reading all month long because I needed to. It went by so fast. I have to show you guys the new mug that I just got from my friend at work. She's a part of our book club. She is our bookkeeper. Isn't this the cutest thing? It was so sweet of her to get this for me. So of course I have to show it off. Let you guys know that I have the best coworkers in the world. And I'm also drinking the tea that she made for our latest book club, which was Divine Rivals. If you haven't read the Letters of Enchantment duology by Rebecca Ross, I don't know what you're doing with your life. Honestly, you need to read them. But this is so cute. All right, onto the books. Just so you guys are aware, I'm going to give like an upfront apology for any names that I accidentally mispronounce as I'm going through this. I'm going to do my best to keep spoilers out, but if there is a book that I have to talk about spoilers in order to like say what I really want to say, then I'll give you a warning. That way you're aware. And also, these are not in the order of star rating. They're in the order that I read the books. The one catch this month is that I have to talk about two at the end because my favorite book of the month was part of a trilogy, so I'm just going to lump those two books together. So the first book is Bittersweet in the Hollow. This one I'm pointing out really quick just because I did pick it up and I did DNF. I didn't DNF because of the plot or anything like that. I actually really think that I would enjoy this book if I had a physical copy, but there was something about the narration and the narrator where I could not focus on the story. I think that it was just so slow and so monotonous, even though I do listen to my audiobooks really fast to kind of keep my mind on them. So this one was a DNF, which is unfortunate, but I do think that I would actually enjoy the story, and I know that book 2 either just released or is about to release. First up is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. This is an adult contemporary romance that does take place in England. Britain? England? We follow Luke O'Donnell, who is the son of a very famous pop star, rock star, singer, you name it. So he kind of goes through all of the trauma of being hounded by the paparazzi, but not being really like important enough for the paparazzi to write meaningful things about him. He works for a nonprofit. This nonprofit has a lot of conservative, traditional people, we might say, donating to it. And so when he gets in the newspapers ads for a rowdy night out, he needs to clean up his reputation so that the donors don't pull out of the charity fund. In order to do this, his best option is to fake date a baron. And our baron is straight-laced Oliver Blackwood. The overall plot here was meh, and I think that if I was reading this in physical form, I wouldn't have been able to get through it because it is so stream of conscience. But that being said, Joe Jameson, who was the narrator for the audiobook, was phenomenal. I mean, it felt like listening to Luke narrate his life. It was wonderfully done. Despite the actual development of the plot being like decent at best, I was really taken by the characters. I love the way that Luke and Oliver offset one another, but also communicated in a way that meant that they were really listening. I love, love the relationship between Luke and his mom. And I also like, without saying like a lot, because I don't want to go into spoilers, I like the way that the relationship with Luke and his estranged father rounded out. It felt very realistic to me, especially when you look at this entire lifetime of gaslighting, manipulation, and trauma. I gave this novel a 4-star rating, and then I also gave it 2 chili peppers out of 5 for a spice rating. If you're ever interested in like where I draw my spice rating from, I do have it on my website. So if you go to my website, go to the top, it's going to say rating system, and then all the way down at the bottom there's like a little infographic where I've broken that down. If you're interested, you don't actually have to go look that up. 2 chili peppers essentially means like closed door, but there's a couple of instances that we have a closed door situation. Next up is The Charm Offensive by Allison Cochrun. This is another adult contemporary romance, and it is essentially like The Bachelor, but if a stage manager fell in love with the actual bachelor. We get dual POV here, so we have Dev, who is the handler on the set, who falls in love with our Prince Charming, which is Charlie, who is an anxiety-ridden, like, little bundle of OCD. Again, I'm a sucker for romantic characters that really complement each other and who communicate well and listen to one another, and I feel like we really got that in this novel, which is something that I appreciated. I also like the way that mental illness was tackled. I like the way that representation within media was tackled, and then systemic oppression, the way that that was tackled specifically in response to our LGBTQ plus community, and then also our marginalized groups. We do get a third act breakup, which is pretty typical in romance frameworking, and it felt organic here. It didn't feel like something that was contrived just to fit the framework, so that was really well done. What I didn't like was the reunion. Like, the ending of the book felt so abrupt. I understood where it came from, but also I was like, wow, that was really fast. So we had some spotty pacing. We had a really abrupt reunion at the end, but we also had well-developed characters and our two main protagonists and an authentic, organic relationship. I gave this novel 3.75 stars and 2 chili peppers for the spice rating. Next up is Interesting Facts About Space by Emily Austen, and this one is a lit fic. This novel follows our hella neurospicy protagonist, Enid, as she navigates her social anxiety, her strange relationship with her step-siblings, her paranoia of bald men, her inability to hold down a romantic relationship, and the gaps in her memory from where she was a teen. And that sounds like a lot, and it all sounds like it's not connected at all, but you find out that all of these things are actually extraordinarily interconnected, and I think that like the way that these subplots all come together to create this just kind of aha moment for Enid and for us as readers, combined with how realistic Enid felt, and then also the internal monologues and the perceptions that she has of the world and the way she thinks of the world, mixed in with these scientific facts about space. Like, that's kind of how she copes and walking through, I don't know, it was just magnificent. I absolutely love this story. There's a book that's publishing, or already published in January, by Emily Austen that intrigued me, so I went back and looked at her other works, and that's why I picked this book up. I highly recommend this if you are a lit fic fan. Austen touches on topics like homophobia, like misogyny, like disability prejudice, all of these different things in a way that never feels like you as the reader are being talked at, which I think is a line that authors can cross, and you lose character voice in that, and it definitely feels like the author is talking to you. That doesn't happen in this novel. I will say is it has a super abrupt ending, and that's kind of typical in lit fic, but it does kind of just, the story just stops, and then the music started playing on my audiobook, and I was like, did I accidentally skip forward? And no, that was the end of the book. So there's that. I ended up giving this a 4.5 stars. Next up is All the Missing Pieces by Catherine Cowles. This is a suspense romance is what I'm gonna go with. It is adult, it is contemporary. Alright, here's what I'm going to say about this book. I have never read a Catherine Cowles, so I knew nothing about this author going in. And after having read the book, when I was filling out my spreadsheets for my tracking and stats and everything like that, I saw covers of other books that Catherine Cowles has written. And I was like, oh, okay. So if I had seen those covers, I would have known exactly what kind of writing I was getting into, and that would have been fine, because I would have, marketing-wise, understood the type of novel this would be. The blurb for this book, combined with the cover for this book, made me think it was going to be plot heavy. There are a lot of things that I did not like about this book, and I did give it a very low star rating, but I do want to say, like, when I give my star ratings, I feel like so many people think that you're bashing the author, and when I give star ratings, I'm thinking that this applies to every single person who put their hands on the book. So it's the person who picked the blurb and wrote it the way that they did. It's the person that picked the cover and made it look like it was not going to be poorly written, like oddly smut-centric mystery around SA and sexual assault. This was the oddest combination of different things. The plot didn't make sense. The actual suspect came out of nowhere. Like, I don't know how you could have possibly figured out who the actual person was, which isn't a spoiler because maybe other people can figure out who it is. There was so much about this that I didn't like, and I did give this 2 stars. I will say that the handling of kidnapping and sexual assault and the way that these cases kind of become cold cases was handled with elegance and with grace. The actual writing, the way that the characters acted around another and were just like lusting after one another the entire time, the really toxic alpha male, like protective, angry thing that Colt, who was our male POV, had going on, it did not speak to me, and I wouldn't have guessed any of these things would have happened based on the blurb. Like, it was the marketing that ruined this for me. So I think that, not actually knowing what I was getting into, and then this being like an insta-lust the entire time, the mystery plot and the romance plot not really lining up with one another, so the plotting and the pacing felt completely disjointed. Toxic masculinity that was happening in here, so much of this didn't work and like drove me into a tailspin, but I was in it for the mystery. Like, I wanted to finish it to figure out what happened. But because the mystery was so poorly written with the plot and the pacing, whenever we got to the actual villain, I was like, what? I think that if you're a Catherine Cowles fan, you know what you're getting whenever you go into this novel, and you will really like it. Because I was not, because the marketing was created in a way to where I really thought this was going to be heavy mystery suspense with a side of romance, I was not enthused. And I did end up giving this, like I said, I gave it a 2-star rating, and then I gave it 3 chili peppers for spice. Next up is Payal Mehta's romance revenge plot by Preeti Chhibber. This is a young adult romance. In this novel, we follow Payal as she creates this entire plan to teach her crush about all of the microaggressions that he is kind of subconsciously and not even realizing that he's committing. And in the context of the novel, she and her partner in crime are calling these baby racisms. Her partner in crime happens to be Philipkin, who is her rival, who she does not very much like. And of course, this kind of gets into a rival lovers thing, because they end up, obviously, this is not a spoiler, like, you know this is coming, but they end up falling for one another. There's so much that's handled beautifully in here, and I will say that reading this, I had to take a step out of my adult shoes and realize that this is 100% written for teens. Like, the entire time I was reading this novel, I was just thinking of students, that I would drop it into their hands and say, take this, you are going to absolutely love this. So, a beautifully written novel that touches on very hard topics to discuss in a way that points out microaggressions, in a way that, the baby racisms, and how these microaggressions happen subconsciously, and that doesn't make them any less dangerous than if it was somebody doing these to be outright cruel. Like, I think that this is handled wonderfully. The thing that dropped this star rating for me, on top of the fact that, like, I was like, okay, think like a teen, think like a teen, think like a teen, is the plot conflict between Payal and her friend Neil. Like, they have this huge beef falling out. Payal doesn't know what's going on. She reaches out to him constantly. He has iced her out, doesn't speak to her, won't respond to any of her talks, and it took up so much page time. Like, it wasn't a minor plot point conflict. It took up a significant amount of the actual plot, and then when we figured out what was going on, it was kind of like, okay. So overall, I think this does really good with identity exploration, with showing different cultures and heritage, with portraying like first love and working through, differences in your first love. This book got a rating of 3.75 stars. Next up is We Could Be So Good by Sebastian. This is a historical romance. So this is set in 1958 New York, where we follow 2 reporters who, find solace in one another's friendship and then eventually fall in love in a time where their love could end up with them being arrested. We get both Nick and Annie's POV throughout this, so we flip-flop between the 2 characters, and I will say, if you're listening to the audiobook narration, there's absolutely no distinction between these characters. Like, not in their POV narration, so when you flip from one chapter to the next, you have to really pay attention to who's actually speaking, because you don't know who it's going to be. And then also with the cast as a whole, like, when different characters are talking to one another, there's no distinction. I was not a fan of this audiobook narration. That being said, because Sebastian does such a good job of creating distinct personalities, that once I understood who these characters were and the way that their dialogue was written, it made it a lot easier to very quickly distinguish who was talking, because the characters themselves spoke differently. I love the way that this is like friendship first and then slow burn into a romance, because it builds this trust between Nick and Andy that I think is just so lovely to see, and that makes this relationship really authentic. I do want to point out that part of the reason this plot works is because Andy has so much money. Like, they are able to keep a stable relationship because of the wealth that Andy comes from. And I think historically that's an important thing to point out, because if both of these characters had been on the lower end of the socioeconomic status, this story could not have panned out the way that it did. And for that reason, I also like the historical note that Sebastian had at the end, where she talks about real events that she put into the actual story, and then explains kind of interesting components of that. I just think that this book was so well composed. I think the characters were so well written and well developed. They had their own personal conflicts, but then they had, you know, these conflicts tie into their relationship. It was just beautiful. It made my heart warm, and I could see these two together forever. This novel got a 4.25 star rating from me, and then it got a spice rating of 2 chili peppers. The next novel I read is You Should Be So Lucky, also by Sebastian, and this is happening in the same universe as the previous book that I just talked about. So we do see Andy and Nick. Oh, I already forgot their names. I just recorded that review and then forgot their names. But the two characters that I talked about for the first book, this title that I just forgot, also are seen in this one. Wow. I hope other people do that. Like, as soon as you finish reading a book or talking about a book, it disappears from your minds. Like, it's just extracted. So in this novel, we also have two protagonists. The same comments that I made about the audiobook narrator for the last book are the same comments that I would make for this one. Like, it's the same person doing both of them. But we follow Mark Bailey, who is an art columnist who gets asked to do a sports diary by Andy, who is his boss, on Eddie O'Leary, who is a baseball player who has been traded to the Robins and who immediately, like, throws a temper, has a fit, everything like that about being traded, and is kind of, like, loved by the city because he's a good baseball player, but hated by the city because he didn't talk well about New York and the Robins and the team. Again, like, so much of what I loved from the previous novel, I loved about this one. I liked that there was so much trust and communication between the two characters. I also enjoyed the fact that these two characters complement one another, that the relationship felt very organic. This was my favorite book out of the two, and it is because both of these characters are grieving, but they're grieving different things. Eddie is grieving leaving his old life, kind of leaving his family, and the way that that's handled is really well done, and the way that his kind of perception of the world is well done. But it's Mark's character and Mark's grief that really struck me in my heart, because he lost his partner due to a heart attack, who he had been with for 8 years. That's not a spoiler. You find that out, like, in chapter 1. I don't think you find out why he died until later, but it's not like a huge plot point of why he died. What's important is that he did. And so you have Mark handling grief, but it's not this, like, completely debilitating hollowness in his chest, which I see so much in novels, which is very, you know, it makes sense that we see that. But the way that Mark handles his grief and the way that we see snippets of his previous partner through kind of his recollections is this idea of, like, you should be so happy for the time that you had with that. I'm tearing up now thinking about it. Like, you should be so happy for the memories you were able to make, for the time that you had with that person. Like, it shouldn't be this wound in the present that keeps you from moving forward. It should be kind of this fondness that shows you what all you potentially could have again. And so I cannot recommend this novel enough for that alone. There's so many other great things that happen here, but Mark Bailey's grief and the way that he tackles that in the moments where it just sledgehammers him and he moves through it, and the way that Eddie is such a great partner to Mark as he's going through, like, it's just I could go on and I'm not going to, but I do highly recommend this novel. You do not have to read these together. You do not have to read them in an order. I do think that if you read them in the order that I did, like, it, you know, you meet Andy and the other character whose name I can't remember first, and so when you see them, it's kind of fun. It doesn't really matter, though. So this did get a 4.5 stars from me, and so far as my chili pepper rating, it got 2. Next up is Beautiful Ugly by Alice Feeney. This is an adult mystery thriller. I will always pick up a Feeney because I feel like her craft and her prose and her writing is just absolutely stunning. The first book I ever read by her was Rock, Paper, Scissors, and it was phenomenal. But, and I'm not going to say very much about this book. I don't feel like there's much that I can say without absolutely spoiling everything, so I'm not. But I will say, as somebody who has read Rock, Paper, Scissors, when I was reading this, like, I genuinely thought the two were connected. They're not. That's not a spoiler. Like, there's no reason for you to have thought that the two were connected, except that the plot points and the themes and, like, certain symbolism that's present within this novel matches up directly with Rock, Paper, Scissors, and to the point where I was gaslighting myself into thinking that this was some kind of, like, hypnosis plot where it was those characters, but I don't know, my mind went crazy with it because there's so many parallels. And so when I got to the end and realize that's not what's happening. And again, that's not a spoiler because there's no reason for you to have really thought that that was going on. It felt like a ripoff of a previous novel that Feeney had written. So I have very mixed feelings about this, and I think I'm going to do like a full-blown review with spoilers because of that. So that's all I'm going to say. If you haven't read Rock, Paper, Scissors, you probably will actually enjoy this a lot more than I did. It's got feminist undertones. You know, we have an isolated island where this is happening. We've got an unreliable narrator. It's really well done. It's just very similar to another book that she's written. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. Next up is All the Water in the World by Eiren Caffall. This is like a climate lit fic apocalyptic science fiction, and it is adult. There's a lot of past and present like flip-flopping back in here, and then the entire time that you're getting kind of this present storyline on top of this past storyline, you also know that it's all being told from an even future point by our protagonist, who is Noni. It took me a good while to like fall into this novel, I think in part because Noni is neurodivergent, and so she's a distant narrator because that's how her personality is. It's also because Noni is so young, and so she's very wise while also being naive. And then also the fact that we're getting these time jumps and we get them rapidly in the beginning, so it's kind of hard to get grounded in what's going on top of the fact that the plot point of, okay, our end goal is to get to the farm. There's a lack of urgency that you would expect to feel in an apocalyptic or a post-apocalyptic narrative, and because this is so literary, it doesn't feel like it's urgent, and that's a very literary thing, to be so introspective and so in the character's head and so into the perception of the world that you lose that survivalist aspect and you lose that urgency aspect. Like, that's why I want to preface that this is very much like literary fiction, climate fiction, with a dash of science fiction because it is apocalyptic. So if you're going into this thinking that it's going to be a survivalist novel, which I think quite a few people, based on reading other reviews, thought it was going to be, you're going to be disappointed. The most important part of this is looking at society. It's looking at the way that we interact with one another whenever we're in this kind of dissolving world and there are limited resources. And it's also thinking about the way that we treat the world. I enjoy literary fiction. I thought that Caffall's writing here was stunning and beautiful, so I really enjoyed this novel. I did give it 4.25 stars. I did listen to the audiobook of this, and it was done by Eunice Wong, and Wong did a phenomenal job of bringing Noni to life. Next up is Funny Story by Emily Henry. This is an adult contemporary romance. We follow Daphne as our protagonist, and we meet her after she is called off her wedding because her fiancé, Peter, cheated on her with his best friend, Petra, during his bachelor party. With no place to go, Daphne ends up moving in with Miles, who was Petra's boyfriend, who, you know, they obviously broke up because Petra cheated on him with Peter at Peter's bachelor party. I love Emily Henry. Emily Henry is my favorite romance author, mainly because, yes, this is a romance novel for sure, but it's like borderline into contemporary because we're dealing with real mental roadblocks that people get because of, you know, childhood trauma that they've suffered. Daphne, our protagonist, really struggles with feeling as though she is settled in a spot, as though she can depend on other people because she did not have a dependable childhood and she was constantly moving around. And then we have Miles, who kind of has the same things going on, but the way that he handles this is rather than icing people out and putting up a barrier, he becomes exactly the person that other people need, knowing that eventually they're going to leave him. And so, of course, you can probably see how these two characters would complement one another, how they would come together. I will say, out of the other books that I've read by Emily Henry, and I think this is just, you know, depending on who you are, you're going to favor different books by Emily Henry. Happy Place I really love because of the friendships that were displayed there, and I feel like we don't quite get that friendship aspect here. There's the attempt at it, but it falls to the wayside a little bit. And then Book Lovers because I really love the family aspect there. And again, we get the family aspect in this novel, but it falls to the wayside a little bit. So this to me was not Emily Henry's strongest novel. That being said, did I absolutely love it? Yeah, I did. It was great. I did end up giving this 4.25 stars, and it got a spice rating of 2 chili peppers. Next up is Single Player by Tara Tide. This is another adult contemporary romance. We've got a lot of adult romances that are happening this month. And this one's really cool because both of our protagonists are game writers. My nail came off. This is another dual POV, so we're following Kat Lee, who has finally gotten her dream job as a romance storyline writer for Compass Hollow, the next big thing in the gaming industry. Unfortunately, she's not able to actually write these storylines because the main narrative writer who's in charge of the entire project, Andy, doesn't want love in the game. I was beyond starry-eyed in the first few chapters of this novel. The character protagonists were leaping off the page. We knew exactly what their desires were, where the conflicts were going to come from. You know, we have this main clash between the two of them that's going to create tension, but then they each have their own personal conflicts that are happening. While I did still like this novel, what I felt kind of pulled it apart for me was the fact that we never progress forward from these conflicts that are set up from the beginning. Like, it feels as though we just keep spinning on the same issue. We don't progress until the very end, and so the storyline gets kind of repetitive. We have Kat and Andy kind of start to move through their attention to like one another, but it's very sudden. I don't feel like they actually built trust between one another or a solid foundation, which is something that I personally need in a romance for it to be believable for me. And you've heard all the other reviews. I've seen that in other novels. So there's so much time spent spinning on these conflicts, but not actually making any forward movement or forward progress, while the relationship itself kind of gets left in the wayside. Like, it almost didn't feel like a romance to me. It felt more like a contemporary talking about misogyny in the gaming sphere, which is very important, and I really like that. But it almost needed to be marketed differently. And I feel like Kat's storyline had a huge plot hole in it because her main conflict is with trying to impress her parents, basically by having a stable relationship. And we get this timeline, as we do in Framework for Novels at the very beginning, that her parents are coming in on Thanksgiving. And so her character flaw that she needs to overcome needs to be handled by the time her parents come for Thanksgiving, and she can stand up for herself and what she actually believes in, what she wants to do with her life, and what she's seeking in a partner. Her parents never come in. It drops. This entire plot line disappears, but it does lead to her fake dating the ex of Andy, and it almost felt like that whole conflict that was the personal conflict for Kat was put in place to create this fake relationship because it would add more tension between Andy and Kat, not because it was meant to create character development for Kat. I hope that made sense. I don't know if it actually did. It felt false in the storyline. It felt like a false storyline. We never actually conclude with this character flaw with the inciting action that set it up. So there were, I guess all of this to say, there were definitely framework issues here. There was good foundation so far as concept, so far as plot, so far as creating that initial conflict. And then things kind of started to fall apart in later chapters. So while there were parts of this that I really enjoyed, and while I think that maybe if it had another one or two developmental edits, it could have been fabulous, it did end up getting a 3.5 star rating from me. And then this also did get a spice rating of 2 chili peppers. Next up is A Restless Truth by Freya Marske. This is not actually the second to last book that I read this month. It was the first book that I read in January, but because it's the prelude to the final installment of the trilogy, which is my top book, I wanted to talk about them together. So that's how this is working out. It is a historical fantasy romance that takes place in Edwardian England, and we do follow 2 protagonists. Y'all have no idea how much I've recorded this trying to explain book 2 without it being so long because so much happened in book 1. So I'm gonna this is what happened. We follow Maud. We meet Maud's brother in book 1, and she is basically escorting a person who has a very special artifact that could, if falling into the wrong hands, end up destroying the magic in Britain or putting the magic in Britain at risk. So that's why she's on the ship. Her brother has prophecies, and so he knows that there is another person on the ship that supposedly is meant to help her, and that is our other POV. So our other POV is Violet. Violet has no idea what's going on. She is an actress who is coming back to England in order to get an inheritance that was left for her. Maud finds her and she gets kind of yanked into this plot. So first thing that happens is the lady who knows what the artifact is that Maud is escorting gets murdered. And this is honestly where the plot starts to fall apart for me, because it's not a murder mystery. We find out almost immediately who murdered the lady. It becomes this like scavenger hunt to try and get the artifact back so that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Except the entire time that Maud and Violet are on this boat, along with some like, you know, companion characters, and then the murderers who are the bad guys, they're all like playing nice with one another. And I get it because they're on a like I understand, but there's this lack of urgency and intensity because they're all just like smiling and doing kind of petty little societal stabs at one another. This just felt like a really slow pacing. I also felt like the relationship between Violet and Maud it felt forced as well. I'm not quite sure what these two characters get out of being in a romance together. For Maud, it kind of makes sense because she's innocent, she's exploring, she realizes that she's lesbian and she's not interested in men, and so Violet is here. Like, it's kind of this awakening for Maud. I don't know what Violet gets out of the relationship. If you've read this and you know, please put down in the comments, because when I finished the book, I was like, I don't think that they're super compatible. So between that and the mystery being kind of predictable and the pacing being a little bit off, this did get my lowest rating out of the trilogy, but I still ended up giving it 4 stars. Like, it was a good book. I enjoyed it. It absolutely would not keep me from reading the rest of the trilogy, obviously. But in comparison to book 1 and book 3, it fell by the wayside. For my spice rating, I gave this 3 chili peppers. And my favorite book for January 2025 was A Power Unbound. It is the last book in the Last Binding trilogy by Freya Marske, and it is absolutely phenomenal. In this installment, we follow Earl Lord Hawthorne and journalist Alan Ross as the final race to save British magic unfolds. I think there was so much that was comprehensive about this novel, like not only in the relationship between these two characters, which I'll talk about in a second, but when you're wrapping up a trilogy like this, we got even more world building that didn't feel overwhelming and didn't feel like it was coming out of nowhere. It just started like really pulling the puzzle pieces together. We got interesting new concepts about the magic system, which lets you know how things are going to progress moving forward for the society, even after the novel is done and the trilogy is done. It's just all threads that have been pulled throughout that are wrapping this up in such a phenomenal manner. And you're getting new information constantly. Like, I do this, like I was flipping the pages, but I was listening to this on audiobook and I was sat. Like, I was up until I finished this playing games on my phone, because I have to play games and listen at the same time in order for me to pay attention. But there was no way I was going to bed until I finished this, because we kept learning more. Not only in the world, but also about our two protagonists and their relationship. Jack and Alan were absolutely compatible. Their personal conflicts and the personal kind of tragedies that they had experienced. Again, you know what I really love in my romances, they had this foundation of trust, they had this foundation of understanding, they had this foundation of communication, and like stopping and taking a step back when frustrated with one another and actually like listening. We have commentary and we touch on kind of the disparity between classes, on power dynamics within society, and then also kind of within relationships. But at no point does this feel like a diatribe that's coming from the author. All of it truly does feel like development of the characters. Even the spicy scenes, which this dips a little bit into kinks. So I did give this a rating of 4 chili peppers because of that, and because like it's, you know, it's explicit. But even in those scenes, like, it feels like we're getting character development. It feels like we're kind of getting plot movement as well. Those scenes weren't just there because there's a romance plot involved. They were there because we are actually getting more information about these characters. And it's just such a wonderful way to write. I have nothing but good things to say about this novel. Everything gets tied up really smoothly. I really love these characters. Their relationships felt organic and authentic. I finished the trilogy, knew that there was more that was going to happen within the society, but I was pleased with where it left off. So if you haven't picked up this trilogy, I do highly recommend it. It's really great, and they're fast reads. Whew, guys, 13 books in January. I just went for it, which is great because I put a good dent in my goal of 100 books per year, and I know that there are some months that I'm gonna like have reading slumps. This was a good reading month. I really enjoyed most of the novels that I read this month. And then reading like the climate fiction, I got out of my depth a little bit with some of the things that I picked up. So that was exciting. Let me know what you read this month, what your favorite book was, and if you happen to read any of the novels that I read as well, and kind of what your thoughts were. Was there something that you noticed that I didn't notice? Was there something that you really enjoyed that I didn't touch on? I have already read a book in February, so we are just kicking February off right now, and then don't mind me covering the school that I borrowed this from, so you guys don't know what district I work in. But I'm reading Dungeons and Drama right now by Christy Boyce. It's a cute little YA. It's, you know, it's fine. But I'm excited for February already. So if you know what's happening on your February TBR, you can tell us that as well.